The following program is a Town of Colony television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Happy New Year. I hope it's a good year for you and your families. I'm Bonnie Edelstein. I'm the director of Death with Dignity-Albany, and I am very pleased to see you all here. Dignity-Albany is a grassroots, all volunteer-led organization that started in 2015. And we have a dual mission. The first part of our mission is to provide a forum for education and discussion of a very broad range of end-of-life issues, like this one today. And the second part of our mission is to advocate for medical aid in dying laws in New York State. And you're going to hear more about that in just a minute. But what I wanted to let you know is that we are independent, but we belong to a four-organization alliance called the New York Alliance for Medical Aid in Dying. And along with us, the other members are Compassion and Choices New York, End of Life Choices New York, and the Death with Dignity National Center. And so what this alliance gives us is a stronger voice so that we're more visible, our voices are heard, and it makes us all stronger, and we collaborate with each other. So there are a number of organizations working on medical aid and dying in New York, but we all collaborate with each other. We're not competitors. As a matter of fact, we could not do what we do in terms of our advocacy work without our partnership with Compassion and Choices. Now, on to our speakers. And for that, let me introduce my esteemed colleague and our Death with Dignity Deputy Director, Jeff Baltus.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're very pleased to have you here, and it's exciting to be able to introduce this program. This program today on funerals and funeral planning is one on which we have had a lot of interest over the course of the past several years. For those of you who have been with us for other programs, you know that we have presented programs on many related issues. And this is one on which we have had frequent questions. People wondering about, well, just what's entailed in planning a funeral? What should I do? What don't I have to do? What's the difference between pre-planning and prepaying? What do I need to know? And more importantly, almost, what will my survivors need to know? And are there things that I can do to help make things easier for them? To that end, we are thrilled to be able to present John Cannon and Glenn Ward, co-owners of the Cannon Funeral Home here in Colony, Central Avenue, out Central Avenue. And they will lead us through the literal maze that may confront you with funeral planning, but also help you to understand that it can be simplified, and there are many steps that you can take. I had the opportunity and the privilege to hear them at another program and was so pleased with their presentation that I suggested to Bonnie that we invite them here today to talk with us. So please join me in welcoming John Cannon, Glenn Ward, who will lead us through funeral planning, what you need to know. John, Glenn.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, folks. I'm John Cannon.
I'm Glenn Ward.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Jeff, Bonnie. Thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to share with you this afternoon. We are co-owners of Cannon Funeral Home in Colony, and our hope is that we can share some information with you this afternoon that will help you better understand all of the choices and options that may be in front of you or a family member with the topic of funeral planning. Not the most exciting topic, we understand. And we know we have great competition with the state of the state this afternoon, so we appreciate you coming to see us versus the governor. I've been fortunate to be a funeral director in New York State for 40 years this year and had the opportunity to serve thousands of families. And from that experience, we've learned so much about the needs and the information that's important to families and to consumers. And that's what we want to share with you this afternoon. Talk a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Glenn Ward. I've been a funeral director for more than 20 years from the area. Had the opportunity to partner with John 3 years ago to create Cannon Funeral Home on Central Avenue. I attended Siena College, got a degree in accounting, and I have a degree in mortuary science from Hudson Valley, so long time presence in the capital region.
So collectively, Glenn and I have a lot of experience, and hopefully that experience and some of this information will prove to be helpful to you today. How many of you in this room may have done some type of estate planning? You have a power of attorney, you have a will, you have healthcare proxy, most of you. Funeral pre-planning is just a natural extension of that kind of business, putting your matters and putting your things in order. So as we talk about this, we discuss funeral pre-planning as something that you might do for your family members. It's a gift that you might present to them. You are not the beneficiary of it. Your family is. You take all that burden off of their shoulders. You ease an awful lot of stress at a most difficult time by clearly stating what your wishes are. That's very simply the crux of why people prearrange. It's for the benefit of others, not so much for themselves. Clearly, you have an opportunity to identify what you want, so no one else could change that. That's your decision. But the beneficiary of that is those that are left behind. There are 3 steps in funeral prearrangement. The first is informational. It's when we sit with folks and we talk about vital statistic information, biographical information. Do you want something in the newspaper? If so, what? Who would be the best source for your obituary? You, absolutely. So there's opportunity to do that. That's informational. Again, that's first step. What are your wishes? Do you know? Do you have a cemetery lot? Do you have church affiliation? Do you want burial, cremation? All these different choices and options.
Just try to hover closer to that mic. Come closer to the mic.
Okay. I'm sorry. That sounds better. Information. Information is powerful. So we're going to hand out in a little while a copy of a blank death certificate. We ask families your parents' names, including your mother's maiden name. That one item is probably the one that people struggle with the most. Would your kids or grandkids or whomever, your loved ones, would they know what your mother's maiden name is? So we'll show that to you. It just kind of helps you understand why we might ask for that information. It also asks for a Social Security number. And some folks are reluctant to share that information for obvious security concerns. But these are some of the questions that come across when we start the prearrangement process, just to ask information. The funeral home is responsible for filing a death certificate. The death certificate is filed in the locality where the death occurs, just as your birth certificate was filed in the locality where your birth occurred. So it's the same idea. And again, we as funeral directors are responsible for filing that certificate in New York State. When we file the certificate, the registrar from that locality issues a permit. That permit must accompany the body to its place of final disposition, whether it's burial, cremation, entombment, anatomical gift. Those are your 4 choices on a death certificate. So I'm just trying to take a couple of steps to explain some of those processes to you. That's why we ask for all of that information.
What are those 4? Cremation, burial, anatomical, and
Entombment, where your body's placed into a mausoleum.
Are you required to have a notice in the paper?
No. The question was, are you required to have a notice in the paper? And the answer is no. 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 We are required to file a death certificate.
You know, people need a social security number
It's
by law,
It's required information on a death
by
certificate.
law.
If we left it blank, that death certificate would come back from the health department. So at the same time that that certificate is filed, we also are ordering certified copies of the death certificate that the family members might need for any business matters in New York State. Those certified copies are $10 each. In New York City, I think they're more, $15 each. And you have the first 6 months, you're able to get those certificates with relative ease. After that, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So we're just taking some steps here. Just the first step, gathering of information, explaining that process of prearrangement. Why do we ask for that type of information? The certificate is filed in the local municipality where the death occurred. So if someone passed away here in the town of Colony, we would file that certificate at Town Hall, town of Colony on Route 9, and then it's the registrar or the town clerk who's responsible for filing with the state. But from our standpoint, we just go to the local registrar.
You can get a copy from the local registrar too later on.
For the first 6 months. After that, it becomes more complicated through the State Department of Vital Statistics.
Does that matter if you reside where you die?
No. The question is, does it matter if you reside where you die? And it does not. Many folks don't pass away in the same locality where they reside. So the certificate is filed where the death occurs, regardless of where your residence is. Well, who notifies the funeral home could be anybody. However, your power of attorney ceases at the time of death. Power of attorney is valid when the person is alive. In many cases, the power of attorney may be the executor or the executrix of the estate too, but as far as legally, and again, we don't hold ourselves out to be attorneys, but we do know that the power of attorney ceases when someone passes. It's only meant to be for helping with their matters while they're alive. So if you have a will, the person that's designated in your will as the executor or executrix then becomes a person of legal responsibility. There's no right answer. It could be anybody. It could be anybody. Whoever finds you, the building superintendent there, which has happened before. We've heard from folks there in the office. So, but eventually, before we proceed with arrangements, we were going to want to speak with a person who has proper authority of your matters.
The question is, if you're an anatomical donor, they would evaluate the situation at the time of your death to see if the medical college staff, they have like a certain criteria that you have to meet. So say at the time of your death, your gift to them meets all their criteria and they accept you, then they would make arrangements with the local. Not for the first part. You could always follow up with a memorial service with a funeral home or service provider. That's a great question. If the question is if you die in a foreign country, I would recommend that you call your local funeral home, your service provider. Yeah, so your next of kin would make an initial contact with a funeral home. It's always easier if you call, like, say, where you want to end up. You know, say you want to come back to Albany, I would call your service provider in Albany, or have your family do that.
But the death certificate.
That's part of the process. What they do is there's independent agents. There's agencies that work for funeral homes, like we can call it International Mortuary Shipping Company. We give them all the information that we would gather from the family. They work with the consulate. They work with the foreign affairs people in the country where you pass away to get you home expeditiously as possible.
That sounds expensive.
It can be. You know, a lot of it depends on the country you die in, because every country doesn't operate the way we do, and some foreign governments expect additional funds. Yeah, but to follow up with that, if anyone was going to do international travel, you can always buy a rider on your travel arrangements. I've heard it be as low as $400 or so. It's kind of like an insurance policy, and if you were to die, it covers all the expenses of the country you're in. So that I would recommend that, looking into that. No, when you make travel arrangements to travel abroad, you can buy insurance, travel insurance, for that, either medical or in case of death. And I do have a friend that works in a company like that that's based in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and they just did a payout of $110,000 to fly somebody that had a heart condition from like Finland back to the United States. So they do pay. Yeah, you certainly can. You can certainly pre-plan without pre-funding. At the end of the day, we have some great resources that you can take home with you that will guide you in that process.
So the way it works is I have to choose what funeral home it's going.
You don't have to.
Oh, I don't.
No. All you have to do, you just put your wishes down on paper. I would recommend that you put it in a place that's accessible once you pass, like not the safety deposit box. Give it to another relative or close friend or who you would want in charge of your arrangements. And the most important thing is let somebody know you did that. So many times people will do this and then families find it after the fact. But no, and you don't have to designate a service provider at the time either. But does a handwritten, pre-planned funeral have any legal standing? I don't think the biographical information has any legal standing.
Your arrangement.
Your arrangement.
Choices, right.
Okay. Don't know the admissibility in the court of law. I haven't seen any case law on that, but I would think that I've never seen anyone go contrary to person's wishes.
Are there legal forms where people could complete that are legal rather than just...
There is one that you can designate who you want to take care of your final arrangements. It's
And,
like
and
a
that
hierarchy.
they honor your arrangements. It's
Right.
on that form. Yeah.
Where's that form exist?
Most funeral homes provide them.
It's all, I think,
Called the
available
designation
online.
of agent.
Right. She was saying that when she's planning her trust, there's a section in the trust where they could designate certain instructions for pre-planning their funeral and final arrangements.
So just the first step that we spoke about with funeral prearrangement is gathering of information. See how much questions it can bring and see how many issues that can come up. So it will continue as we go through these steps. So please, as you have questions, we want to answer your questions and help you in any way we can. So again, we talked about gathering of information. vital statistic information, biographical information, your specific choices, cemetery lot, burial, cremation, church, no church, viewing, no viewing, all those things. And each funeral home will go through and explain options to you. And more importantly, what's it cost? Because that's the next step. Based on your choices or the options that you choose, eventually a funeral home, when you pre-arrange a funeral, will provide a complete itemized statement of your choices and the costs associated with those. Every funeral home has and must provide a general price list. General price list is an itemized list of all of the different options, choices, and types of service that a funeral home can provide. If you look at a general price list, it's not what we would consider to be very consumer friendly. It's just that it's something that the FTC put together. We have to follow it. New York State Health Department guidelines, we have to follow that. But most folks could look at a general price list but not figure out what the funeral costs. So we consolidate it and try to explain it for people in a more understanding term. But from that, you can pick the items you want. If you don't want viewing, then you don't need to have embalming. If you don't want public visitation, then you don't need to pay for the use of the facilities. So all of these different choices that you make will determine what the final costs might be. The question was, if I pre-arrange and prepay my funeral in full now, and someone as young as Amanda lives for another 50 plus years, will there be a gap in the costs or the expenses? And the answer is maybe. Well, here's the thing, and I don't mean to be evasive. At our funeral home, we have a guaranteed price policy, which means if you prepay your funeral in full now, whenever you pass, a year from now or 50 years from now, it will not cost you or your family any more money. And it's clearly spelled out in our contracts. That we offer is an option. Every funeral home is different. They can offer a guaranteed price or not. Most funeral homes do. The idea is that those monies that you prepay, by law, must be placed in an interest-bearing trust account. The idea is that the interest will keep up with inflation. So the trust that most of the funeral homes in New York State use is called pre-plan. Pre-plan is this master trust set up specifically for prearranged funerals. We, the funeral home, do not take possession of your money, nor are we allowed to. The money must go on deposit in your name, in your Social Security number, in trust for the funeral home. And only upon our presentation of a certified copy of the death certificate that shows that we handled those services, then the trust pays us. So the money is still considered yours. So much so, the IRS says the 1099 must go to you every year for the interest that it earns, because it's still your money. Does that help answer your question? Okay. Revocable, 100%.
I had originally planned with one funeral home, and I pulled it out, and I
Right.
went to another. You know.
So the money is set up by law in a revocable account, which means at any time you can ask for your money back. The only time that it changes, and it must become irrevocable, is if somebody is applying for or already on Medicaid. Then those monies must be in an irrevocable trust so that nobody can take them back out, because they are clearly set aside for that individual's funeral expenses. Those monies then are exempt from Medicaid and no longer looked at as an asset, only under that circumstance. Yes. The question is, we have a life insurance policy that this young lady would like to deed to the funeral home for her final expenses. Well, the law is,
Make us the beneficiary.
Most insurance companies now will not allow a funeral home to be a beneficiary. It used to be that we could. So it has to be an individual. That's in most cases. Do you understand
Yes,
it to
correct.
be the same way? So more times than not, people are not designating a funeral home for insurance as a beneficiary anymore.
I want to know how much interest you get.
Pre-planned currently, I think it's
1.84.
1.84, close to 2. What happened?
2%.
The interest rate currently generated by pre-plan again is this master trust. So their interest rate always usually runs a tad higher than what you could usually get in a local bank or credit union. Just because it's such a big trust that each individual policyholder generates a better interest rate. Every single one of those accounts is FDIC insured, so the money is safe. There's no question about it. New York's laws, when it comes to pre-need and business law, are strict or stricter than most states. For good reason. It's to protect the consumer's monies. The question was, if your pre-plan account is designated as a ABC funeral home, upon your death or prior to that, if you choose to, you can change it to XYZ funeral home. That's well, the new firm usually going to require a few forms. Yeah. Well,
Transfer affidavit.
there's an affidavit that has to be signed. We have to, as the new firm, write up a whole new current price itemization. So if you had prepaid 10 years ago with ABC Funeral Home, and you had to switch, you choose to switch now, we'd have to write up a new current itemized statement, get the affidavit, and a revocable trust agreement. That's what's required.
At a new price.
It's not, that's the new firm has the choice. Are they going to charge you more than what you've already paid? We wouldn't do that. I don't think it's very wise if someone else did it. But
Right.
plan is the name of the trust, just coincidentally. The name of the trust where the money goes in New York State is called pre-plan. So it's just a commercial name. The trust's name is, you can pre-plan your funeral arrangements and not pay for anything.
Okay, yes, we choose
Okay.
more about that.
Right, so remember, we talked about first step, all that gathering of information. Second step, making choices, picking out what you want and writing it all out, itemize what does it cost, and completing it and signing it. First two steps are pre-planning. You've made all your choices, you've spelled everything out, and you know what it costs at today's prices. That's the first two steps, pre-planning. Third step is optional, and that's where you prepay. And some folks choose to prepay partially, or they'll make a deposit and then add to it any amount at any time. You can do that. The guaranteed price policy only becomes in effect once it's been paid in full. But many people are prepaying their funeral expenses with monthly payments or quarterly payments. We have so many different circumstances, but sometimes we'll meet with a couple and they'll prepay for one and not the other because one has ample life insurance and maybe the other didn't. Everybody's circumstances are different. So what's right for you could be completely different from the person sitting next to you. That's the beauty. It should be what's right for you. Nobody should say you should do this or you should do that. It's what's best for you in your circumstances. That's a really important part of this, I think. Yes, sir.
Gentleman's question is, there's some fees associated with the trust. By statute, the trustee can take 0.75 basis points, and that's how they admit, those are the fees that they use to administer the trust. and for the accounting and sending out the 1099s at the end of the year, and also all the regulatory and compliance issues that they have to meet for the New York State Banking Department and federal agencies. Now that yield that we told you about earlier, for example, the 1.84%, the basis points, the yield is net of the basis points, which means that the basis points have already been taken out before the consumers. And people may ask, well, how can you get that if you can't have it in the your local bank? The trust has what they call laddered CDs, which means years ago, every week they'll buy CDs with the deposits that come in. So they've got a blended rate of return from, they may have some 10 or 15-year treasuries there that are giving them, 3 or 4%. So that, and then the ones they're buying today may come in under 2%, but at least they have a blended rate of return for the consumer. One's question is, if there's no viewing, he understands that there doesn't need to be embalming, which is true. Embalming is not required by New York State law. Your question is, how soon does the body need to be disposed of? I would say that there's no time limit in writing, but my answer to that question would be as soon as practically possible. Usually when we see circumstances like that, it's usually within a couple days. The question is, does Social Security still provide $200 toward funeral expenses? It's a great question. Social Security actually pays $255. So, and what they do is, it's not for everyone though. It's dependent spouse, one-time special payment is the terminology. So what that means is you have to be married and have a surviving spouse that applies for it. It's a one-time payment.
It's the same amount it's been since 1938.
Yeah, we always recommend that you follow up with your local Social Security agency. But to go back to your question, Amanda, if there was a situation where there's minor children or something, there may be other survivor benefits, or if you've been married for a certain period of years, and the spouse is of a certain age. So we always recommend that you just do a whole overview of your situation with the local Social Security Administration. The question is, what we talked about with the gentleman's question about embalming and how soon to dispose of someone, if in the case of cremation, the same would hold true. Yes, ma'am. Question was, can you go from the hospital directly to the crematory? I think what the usual practice would be that the body would be removed from the place of death, sheltered in a funeral home. There's appropriate documentation would be gathered, permits filed, death certificate filed, authorizations obtained from the family, and then once all the proper documents are in order, then you go to the crematory. The gentleman's question is if he's chose cremation, is embalming required? Embalming is not required prior to cremation.
I didn't mean required. I mean, does it make any difference in burning?
Not necessarily, because the temperature is so hot that it wouldn't matter. The question is, do the funeral homes have relationships with the crematories? Are they subsidiaries? That kind of thing. There's a two-part answer to that. Number one, every funeral home has a relationship with a crematory that they choose as a service provider for their families.
In other words, there's just one with your funeral parlor and a different one for another one? Is that okay?
We have one that we use more often, but we would certainly honor a family request if they wanted to go to a different one. And then all that's based on your relationship with them and service. But the other part, to answer your question, is in New York State, a funeral home can't be in any kind of relationship with a crematory as far as a subsidiary or ownership or stockholder or anything like that. The function is two separate entities. Based on what you've said, if you want to make the arrangements but not prepay, you've done steps 1 and 2. Some people don't ever prepay because they have other alternative methods that they want to pay with at the time of death. For example, the proceeds coming from a trust or a life insurance policy or an employer benefit or that kind of methods for payment. So it's certainly not required. Correct. That the statement was made that you would be paying at today's price. I don't think there'd be catastrophic differences in pricing based on the market conditions, but I would say that, you know, it may be a few dollars more percentage-wise. That is a separate charge that's included in our estimate, and those are what they call third-party charges. Third-party charges are not marked up to the consumer, so if the local cremation provider charges $340, that's what appears on your statement.
What kind of paperwork is involved with the crematorium?
The crematorium requires an authorization from the family, which is a form provided by them. It covers many topics, from the requirements of the crematory to the policies and procedures. The third part is usually your authorization part, where you as the next of kin or the designated person is authorizing the cremation. So it's all-inclusive form that is actually only one form that's used. All crematories use the same form that's provided by the New York State Division of Cemeteries. So years ago, we had all these different forms and contracts and languages. The state has gone through and vetted this form, provided it to all the funeral homes and crematories. So it works very well. Each cemetery is different on their rules, regulations, and requirements. I will say that most cemeteries do require an outer enclosure.
Outer enclosure.
Right, that's the terminology used. And it can be as simple as a concrete box.
Yeah, and that is also part of the expenses to the funeral.
Correct. That would be itemized in your step 2 of pre-planning as far as, like, you know, your options. Several options with those types of merchandise, but the basic concrete box or grave liner would satisfy the requirement.
And we were going to touch on that topic, excuse me. The Most Holy Redeemer in Niskayuna has a natural burial section,
Right.
which is green burials or earth burials, which has become more and more of interest to the consumer.
Does that require this container?
No. It does not require that outer container like most cemeteries do, right? And that's, the regulations there, the bodies are not embalmed. The casket or container is usually something made of a biodegradable material or wicker or that kind of thing. They even ask for clothing without any metal or, you know, so there's many different, and those interests seem to be increasing a little bit more and more by the consumer. Yeah. They could be buried in a cemetery. They could be entombed in a mausoleum. They can be taken home by the family. And what the family does with them after that is not something that we take responsibility for. But the people do scatter ashes in, you know, somewhere that's meaningful and significant to them.
There must be a state regulation where they can scatter or not.
Well, the regulation is that the distribution or scattering of ashes must comply with any local ordinance or law. Unfortunately, we don't know of many laws or local ordinances that specifically address how you scatter ashes. So we very respectfully suggest that you use a great deal of discretion and common sense. If you had prearranged, is there common, or an event where someone in the family comes in and wants to go ahead contrary to what was originally arranged by that individual? And I will say, very, very rarely. Thank God.
Right.
Yeah. I think most people are pretty respectful of those wishes that have been spelled out, and quite frankly, takes all the burden off that person, so it's all been done for them. So thank God it's not much of a challenge. We prearrange a funeral and you prepay, you are the customer. And we're
Right.
always honoring the person who is our customer. Just as if someone signs an authorization for cremation as next of kin, we are responsible to return the ashes to that person. That's the customer, that's the designee for that. Or they could designate someone else. But a lot of questions. This is great.
Yeah, I like
This is great. I don't know how much time we got, but we'll go all day for you. So this young man here has been waiting a long time. Very good question. If he passes in California, can they call us and let us handle everything? And that's really the best thing to do. The worst thing you want to do is have to try to deal with 2 funeral homes. And the family, it's much easier, as Glenn had stated earlier, to deal with the funeral home that will be handling the final services. They can arrange to have the person transferred home. They know the regulations, so it's much easier for a family to deal with one firm. Yeah, so number 2 was the general price list. You go through, you make your choices. We spell out an itemized prearrangement statement showing the costs and expenses of everything that you've chosen, including the things that Glenn mentioned, that those third-party charges. Third-party expenses could include things like cemetery or crematory, newspaper notices, obituaries, certified copies of the death certificate, clergy or church affiliation or costs associated with those. So we spell out, based on your choices, we spell out all of the other third-party expenses as well. So once we've completed that form, explained it to you, asked you to sign it, that is prearrangement. You've finished step 1 and step 2.
And you don't charge me?
No, nor can we. There is no, it's not allowed to be in New York State. So then the third step is if you choose to do any type of prepayment. And again, prepayment, anything prepaid, those monies must be placed in your name, in your social security number, in trust for the funeral home. If you write a check for prepayment, the check is not made out to the funeral home, it's made out to Preplan, the name of the trust. You can prepay in full, you can prepay partially. There's no absolute right way or wrong way. Again, I go back to what's best for you. If you complete step 3 and you prepay, and say you prepay in full, there's nothing else to do. We will offer some suggestions on a little bit of homework, like write your own obituary. Or if you're not comfortable, at least jot down the information. Again, we said this earlier, who's the best source for that information? How much do you want in the paper? Newspaper notices have become very expensive. For example, we have a funeral scheduled right now where the obituary is relatively small, but they put a much longer article on our website and on our Facebook page, and there's no cost to do that. And in today's digital world, people are learning of services and death much more online or in a much quicker fashion than the old traditional newspaper. So there, again, there's no right way or wrong way. So those are the steps, and if you complete those 3 steps, you put down some information biographically. We're going to ask specific questions about clothing. Do you have a specific preference? Hairdressing, pallbearers, flowers, all kinds of other questions that might come up. That's part of those first 2 steps. We're trying to get all of the questions addressed now. And sometimes you don't get it all done, but you get a major part of it. And again, if you finish step 2 and you're comfortable with that, you're prearranged. Or if you finish step 3 and you're comfortable with that, that's great too. To us, it doesn't matter. As long as you do one of those choices, the end result for us is the same. There's no money up front, nor should there be. This is about creating peace of mind. It's a huge part. And if we can't do that, then we shouldn't even be trying. We shouldn't take up your time. It's all about peace of mind, not just for you, but for your family too. And we see it every day. And folks come in and say, oh, I'm so glad Mom did this. So those 3 steps, hopefully, answers your question, helps you better understand what's involved. No, but the only other, the other caveat, if you will, is step 3, if you prepay and you prepay revocable, but end up going into a long-term health care situation 30 years from now and you have to apply for Medicaid, your revocable account, they'll ask you to transfer it to irrevocable, so nobody can touch it. Okay? Yes, the steps if someone passes away at home. If they have been under the care of a physician or hospice, usually it's considered an attended death, which means it's not a medical examiner or a coroner's case. And once the physician or hospice speaks and gives authorization that they will verify the death and sign a death certificate, then a funeral home can be called.
Who does what?
Well, it depends. If I can, family calls many times the police. The police come and verify that there's no foul play, and then they call the local coroner or medical examiner who asks these questions about physician, been under the care of a doctor, and once they verify it, then the police or the coroner will call the funeral home of the family's choice to say that they can transfer. That's under pretty normal circumstances. If there's circumstances where it appears to be a sudden death, somebody had not been under the care of a doctor, then the police are called and it's almost automatically a legal investigation. It could be natural causes. It could not be, but they still have to go through that process. And that, locally, then the coroner is involved, and usually the body is transferred to Albany Medical Center or Ellis Hospital until the medical examiner or coroner determines whether there will be or should be an autopsy. And the body would not be released to a funeral home until those legal steps are taken.
But usually the police are involved. I mean, that's just.
The police are involved. They could be called to the residence when someone passes away because folks don't know what to do, so they call the police. The police call, the police will come, and then they might engage the coroner or the medical examiner if necessary. If someone's under the care of hospice locally, they are instructed to call hospice. And the nurse who's on call will come to the residence. They have a process to go through and paperwork, and then it's usually the nurse that will call the funeral home. Most hospice patients do not need to go to medical examiner, coroner, or anything like that because they've been under the care of a doctor. Does that help, Bon?
Yes.
Well, it's still considered unattended, but you might have the police come, but once they verify the person had been under the care of the doctor, that doctor is willing to sign a death certificate. That's a big part of it. You need somebody to verify that that person passed and the doctor was aware of their condition and was something that they would have been expecting. Because if you don't do that, then we don't have proper verification. But I think if you call 911 and you had medical personnel at the residence and they determined that the person had passed, they might not take those other steps. What they're instructed to do is to run a strip, correct?
Yeah.
EMT, grade
12 lead.
Glenn is an EMT, so they're instructed to run a strip before they leave and pronounce that person had passed to make sure that there's no sign of life. Pardon? It's an EKG. Yeah. Jeff been under the care of a doctor recently? If so, who is the doctor? We're going to need to get some verification.
All right, so you would then push
Take
that
those
into
steps.
gears.
Yeah.
Right. Keep going back to who is verifying, what medical professional is verifying that that death is of natural causes.
So that's terms of the medical there, and they sign off, and they basically the coroner.
But people aren't signing off casually. I mean, they're really taking the steps to make sure absolutely, yep, absolutely. Yep. Yes, sir. No, the question is, does a doctor or a medical professional have to be present to view the deceased? And the answer is no. I would say most patients that pass away in the hospital are not viewed by a doctor. You know, a nurse or, you know, somebody who's trained. Or at home, right. In the hospice, most cases it's a nurse. So, you know, it's not always a doctor.
But the signing off will be by the doctor.
Well, again, there's communication to know that that doctor had attended or cared for that patient, was aware of their conditions, because it's that information that they're signing as part of their cause of death.
Yeah.
Right. So there has to be some communication with the physician.
Where does the coroner fit in?
Coroner and medical examiner are very similar. Question is, what does a coroner fit in? The only difference is a coroner is an elected official. A medical examiner is a doctor. They kind of play the same role, if you will, but the medical examiner's better trained, better educated, and can perform autopsies, where the coroner is someone who will report to the scene, serving this, well, but they're serving a purpose, but then they make all of their referrals to a physician or a pathologist who would be doing the autopsy. Yeah. Yes, the question is, this young lady is from Massachusetts, and how would we recommend to her to find a funeral home to her in regard that she only wants cremation? And I guess my answer would be, regardless of what you want, I would look for referrals from your neighbors, your friends, people that you have trust and confidence in. That's the best way, because every funeral home can handle a cremation or a burial. So I don't think there's that difference. Is it a facility or people that you're comfortable with? That's, to me, a big deal. The question is, if there's no services, why wouldn't you just use the least cost provider? And that's the beauty of consumerism. We all get to choose what we want for whatever services we want, even if it's in funeral service. So it's what you're comfortable with. But I wouldn't be, I guess I can't let it go without saying, I want somebody I trust, somebody I think is professional, somebody that's going to be respectful and honor. And I would say 99.9% of all of our colleagues fit into that category. But for somebody in your family is going to sit down with these folks and have to go through an arrangement process and sign cremation documentation and hopefully be treated well. And to me, that's worthy of a little bit of homework to make sure it's somebody you're comfortable with.
The question is, she lives in Massachusetts, and if she dies here, oh, she lives here, would it be just like burial in Massachusetts?
No, services.
Okay. Well, correct.
Correct.
The death certificate would be filed here. So if you were just having a graveside service in Massachusetts, it's not uncommon for funeral homes to cross state lines just to perform a partial service.
But
Like
to
if-
answer your question, yes, I would prearrange in Massachusetts. Funeral homes help each other all the time. So if we had a death in Springfield, we're probably going to call a funeral home in Springfield to help us file the death certificate before we can transfer back to Albany. So that type of cooperation
Right.
goes on all the time.
In the back, there's the local organ bank that I think they maintain a database of prospective donors.
If you write on your driver's license, then they have you in this database?
I believe so, yes. And then obviously at the time of your death, they would cross-reference that to, they confirm, yes, she was a donor, and then they would evaluate the situation or circumstances to see if you're a good fit. Right, there's certain baseline criteria that they go through to evaluate the person to see if they're still a donor. I believe you can. You can register for both, and then the two, they would have to talk to each other and see, you know, maybe they're just going to take the cornea of your eyes, and then you're going to do an anatomical donation. That might be a good fit for both of them, but as far as other gifts, they would have to work with each other. There is a company out there that does like third-party data collection, and you know, the name escapes me right now.
Parting.com.
Is that what it is? Okay.
Parting. It's all across the country. They get copies of funeral homes' general price
Right.
lists. But again, they're not consumer-friendly forms. I just warn you, you can look at them and you still look and say, well, I still don't understand what it costs. Because it's just a menu.
Yeah.
But parting.com they're out of Los Angeles, I think. It's interesting to see what they have compiled.
Right.
I'll be honest, I don't know if our list is on parting.com, but I will tell you it's on canonfuneral.com. It's on our website. Most funeral homes don't show their prices. We do. And here's the other thing. Do you see recently where hospitals now have to show their pricing? It just started last week. It'll only be a matter of time before funeral homes have to show them.
Right.
And they should. Why shouldn't they? So
Right.
that's my public service announcement for the day.
But depends on what the circumstances are, but you could, you know, there's also an option of refrigeration sometimes, and how quick is your children going to get here? Like if they're on a trip and they're not going to be here for 2 weeks, then embalming may be the best. Right, within a couple days, yeah. Over here. So a family could request for an autopsy. If it's not through the medical examiner's office, they could request an independent autopsy. A forensic doctor, a pathologist. Yeah, Albany Med. I believe there's a couple of pathologists in the Capital Region that offer that service.
It's expensive.
Yeah. I've heard like $3,000 to $5,000 with the lab work. I mean, they have to do all the lab work too. But I don't have anything to base that on other than conversations. Depends on how long before the time limit or the time between death and burial.
When would the burial be taking place?
Rather quickly.
So probably not. They used to when they first started years ago. The question is, does a mausoleum or a cemetery require that the body must be embalmed? But if it's not to be embalmed, we would take some steps to try to make sure that there's extra precaution and the body may be, eventually before the casket's closed, the body may be put into some type of heavy-duty material or medical supply, so it prevents for any problems down the road. That's just common practice, all for good reason. With great respect for everybody's time, I'm just want to, before anybody leaves, there's a great deal more material that we've put in the back that we encourage you to take. A lot of it is specific to prearrangements, but it also some opportunity for you to give some thought to what you want. That's the whole gist here. And some of the steps that we've talked about reinforces what you do or what you might want to do if you are interested in pursuing prearrangement. We will stay, Glenn and I would be happy to stay behind and answer any questions you might have, and we'll be here for as long as it might be to help answer those questions. Thank you so much for this opportunity, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much for helping lead us through this maze. We hope that we didn't confuse you more than enlighten you. But as John said, the whole purpose is to make things easier for your survivors, but also to assure that your wishes are being met. Bonnie is going to just close our program with a few additional details. Thank you so much for coming. We hope you found this a helpful and informative presentation.